People are defying curfews in the U.S. to protest against police brutality and racism. It is the sixth day of demonstrations after an unarmed black man died in police custody. So this is the scene right now in Washington, D.C. There are protesters that set fires. This is near the White House. A curfew is just now coming into effect. George Floyd's death has prompted a wave of outrage across the country. Mike Hanna's live for us in Washington, D.C. Mike, I think it bears repeating the overwhelming majority of protests throughout the day are peaceful protests, but these other things are happening as well. So tell us what kind of set the scene for us, these fires that are near the White House.
Indeed, yes. Well, it was largely peaceful throughout the day. There were some moments of tension, but generally demonstrators kept their distance from the police. The White House itself was barricaded behind a series of lines of defense, Secret Service on the inner perimeter, then U.S. Park Police, Metropolitan D.C. Police, keeping the demonstrators a distance of about 200 meters away from the White House. But about an hour ago, there were some bangs thrown that sounded near the White House. It appeared that police were throwing flashbangs at the demonstrators near the park, attempting to get them to disperse. Then the situation appeared to escalate. All of a sudden, there were fires breaking out in various areas and what police now describe as acts of vandalism. The fire engine has been on the scene, but for a while, the situation was really tense with police and some elements of the demonstrators in an ongoing standoff. Some tear gas was fired. As I said, the flames continuing to lick within view of the White House. So certainly a day that had been largely peaceful, rather marred by the events of the last few hours. The situation now appears to be resuming an element of calm at this particular point, but it's a long night to go. The curfew has just come into force. A curfew was announced by the city's mayor in force from 11 p.m. Eastern until 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. That is now in force, and that perhaps is a reason for this recent outbreak of unrest within the city. The police apparently intent on dispersing the demonstrators well before the time for curfew. Now, the mayor herself said that she doesn't expect those who are willing to carry out acts of vandalism, as she put it, to actually observe curfew laws. So she said the law enforcement officials will still be on standby throughout the night to try and snap out or prevent any further acts of vandalism, such as one saw late into the early hours of this morning.
So, Mike, a moment like this cries out for leadership. U.S. President Donald Trump has one approach. Vice President Joe Biden, the presumptive nominee, has a different approach. So let's start with the way Donald Trump has been responding. He's been tweeting, as he usually does, and he's singled out this group that's not really a group exactly, Antifa, to aim his fire at them. What is he doing with this?
Well, indeed, yes. He tweeted in the course of the morning that Antifa was going to be designated a terrorist organization. Antifa stands for anti-fascist. It's a movement that has its origins back in the 1920s and 30s in Europe. As its name implies, it is anti-fascist. Now, it came into force again in the United States as a response largely to the rise of Donald Trump and the alt-right movement, as it puts it. Now, Antifa as a umbrella body, essentially, has never shied away from violence, but it is not an organization as such. It is various disparate parts, predominantly left-wing. But importantly, there's no U.S. law whatsoever that provides for the designation of a domestic group as a terrorist force. So that point of President Trump's tweet is completely incorrect, as one could put it that way. And the mayor of Washington, D.C. once again took the president to task, asking for signs of leadership from the White House rather than signs of division that she has seen him as carrying out in recent days. Now, on the other hand, as you mentioned, the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, was out at a protest site in the course of the day. Unlike President Trump, He was wearing his mask. But very significantly, too, Vice President Biden put out a tweet in which he said it's necessary to listen to what the protesters are also going to say. But he included a photograph with it of him kneeling on the ground. Now, this is very reminiscent, whether intentional or not, of the African-American athletes of recent years who took a knee, as they put it, to protest police brutality. And certainly, as I said, whether it was intentional or not, the image is there. Vice President Biden tweeted it out, and certainly that is going to resonate with protesters in particular. And certainly it goes a long way to show the fundamental difference between the approaches of the man in the White House and the one who will challenge him in a few months' time.
And a footnote to the Antifa tweet from U.S. President Donald Trump: the KKK is not even designated as a terrorist organization. Mike Hanna, live for us in Washington. Thank you. A truck was driven into protesters in Minnesota. The tanker was traveling along a closed highway near downtown Minneapolis, where demonstrations were happening over the killing of George Floyd. This is where it all began. So people in the crowd moved out of the way. There are no reports of any injuries, but still really a dramatic picture to see. John Hendren.
Now, I'd like to address what many of you saw within the last hour, a horrifying image on our television. A semi-truck illegally entering the closed freeways appears to be with a flammable or toxic substance driving nearly full force into a crowd of thousands of peaceful protesters. I've been briefed at this point in time. The driver was taken to Hennepin County Medical Center with injuries sustained, being pulled from the vehicle. Commissioner Harrington will follow up further. I believe that driver was arrested. We do not have any confirmed cases of injury.
Okay, our John Hendren is in Minneapolis, where all of these protests started. John, as the pattern seems to be throughout the day, these are overwhelmingly peaceful protests. But when it comes time for curfew, when it comes to nighttime, that's when sometimes things can pivot. So what is happening there now, particularly with the additional National Guard troops in town?
Well, that's exactly right, Rochelle. During the day, there were peaceful protests, people with their children and dogs at the place where George Floyd died, which is now a memorial. It was kind of a somber but festive scene in the sense that people were celebrating a kind of solidarity after this event. But then after curfew, the police in the past 2 nights have gotten increasingly aggressive. Ever since they got those extra 1,000 National Guard troops, they now have a total of 1,700. And what that does is it frees up the police, and the police have gotten very aggressive. Yesterday, it took them about 15 minutes to clear out an area where thousands of protesters were peacefully gathered. And then tonight again, what happened is, if you can see that light behind me, that is a light with a line of police and police vehicles. I'm not sure if you're able to see them, but they are all standing there. If we were to approach there, they would shoot with rubber pellets, sometimes tear gas. Every time a car goes down that street, they get that experience. So the police have pushed protesters to both sides of the highway, and now there's just this kind of standoff. What had happened the first few nights was the protesters really owned the night. Some would burn buildings, there was looting. And that hasn't happened so much in the past 2 nights because the police have acted extremely aggressively with liberal use of tear gas and those rubber pellets, and they have shut down areas where the protesters were gathered, and today they have divided them. So that extra 1,000 National Guard troops seems to have made a difference.
So, John, where do things stand with the 4 officers that ignited all of this? We know that Derek Chauvin has been charged, obviously. And we still don't know if that will ever get to court or who'll be found guilty. But there's these other 3 officers that are involved. This all happened with all 4 of them. Where do things stand with these officers?
All we know about the legal case there is that the prosecutors say they are still investigating those officers. There were 4 officers involved. One simply stood guard and did essentially crowd control. 3 others knelt on the back of George Floyd, and of course one of them, Derek Chauvin, had his knee on the neck of Floyd, and that seems to have been what caused him to lose consciousness and later die. So Chauvin has been charged, the others have not, and that's part of why you have people out in the street here. thousands of people in Minneapolis, and of course, as you heard Mike Hanna describe, all over the country. And here in Minneapolis, the goal I keep hearing from everyone I talk to is that they want all 4 of those officers to be arrested and charged with murder. And then secondarily, they want to see an end to incidents of police killing unarmed black men. Those are the demands, and the people we've talked to here say they will stay in the street until they achieve them.
Okay, John Hendren in Minneapolis. John, thank you. So in Atlanta, 2 police officers have been fired for using excessive force on protesters. Riot police surrounded a car and arrested the couple inside. So the footage shows the police slashing their tires, breaking their window, and using a taser, and the couple was not resisting. They were pulled from the car and handcuffed on the ground. The city's police chief said members of her force cannot be allowed to act with impunity.
I think as law enforcement, if we are ever going to get out of this space that we are in today, we have to recognize that our behaviors cannot consistently be pardoned because we are law enforcement. These are good guys. I know them as individuals. I've worked with the one for over 20 years. But they made that level of mistake that cannot be rolled back.
So video has emerged of a police car driving into protesters in Los Angeles. The vehicle is seen making contact with the protesters and then reverses and then drives away. So we see it there. Okay, Rob Reynolds is live for us in Los Angeles. So what else do we know about what's going on there and also the state of emergency, Rob, that the governor has declared?
State of emergency covering the entire county of Los Angeles. That's 10 million people, Rochelle. There are curfews in place, which are going into effect now, if they have not already done so. And throughout the day, we saw, again, a kind of pattern emerge. Peaceful protests that then became somehow deteriorated into acts of destruction. The focus of the protests today shifted from downtown Los Angeles to 2 seaside cities, Long Beach, which is the largest port in the United States, and Santa Monica, which is a popular sort of vacation beach town to the west of downtown LA. In both places, largely peaceful protesters throughout the day marched along the streets, police keeping their distance from them, but in the middle of the afternoon here in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica rather, there were incidents of people breaking into stores, taking out merchandise and running away, sometimes jumping into cars and then speeding off. These people seemed to have no connection to the peaceful protesters who were protesting the death of George Floyd, police brutality in general, and systemic racism. In the last couple of hours, the police in Santa Monica have emerged in very large numbers to arrest the remaining protesters, people who were not fighting with the police, but nevertheless refused to disperse. Now they are dispersing, and many of them have been placed under arrest. In Long Beach, there was also peaceful protesting, but also looting at a shopping mall there. So we are now under curfew in Los Angeles. There are National Guard troops on the streets, and many people here saying they've seen nothing like this, of course, since more than 25 years ago during the 1992 riots after the conviction of officers accused of beating motorist Rodney King.
Okay, and those officers were, of course, exonerated, although it was clear what they did on tape. Rob Reynolds, live for us in Los Angeles. Thank you. There's also been criticism of the police response after a car was seen ramming into demonstrators in New York City on Saturday. The patrol car went into protesters behind a barricade. The city's mayor, Bill de Blasio, says an investigation will take place.
That is not the way things are supposed to be. There will be a full investigation, and if discipline is necessary, there will be. But do not present only one side of the picture. I looked at those videos. I saw people converging on the police vehicle. I saw people throwing things at the police vehicle. That is not peaceful protest. So let's not kid ourselves. If you or anyone else was inside that police vehicle surrounded by people, you would have had a really tough decision to make. You can't stay there. You can't get out of the vehicle. You have to get yourself and the vehicle out of the situation safely for all.
So there have been more protests in New York City on Sunday. Gary Elizondo has been among them.
In one of the most famous spots in all of America, Times Square, and protesters are out in force. Thousands of them out here making their voices heard. You can see them. It's young people, it's old, it's white, brown. You're getting a whole cross-section of New York City here. They are angry and they are calling for justice, and they are taking their message out to all parts of New York City, including here right by Times Square. On Saturday, we saw protests in all the 5 major boroughs of New York City. We are seeing protests on Sunday as well. It is mostly very, very peaceful here, but the crowds, as you can see, are absolutely huge. Some of the largest crowds we have seen in years for protests ever in New York City.